It took Mary Jane Leach 7 years to find enough of Julius Eastman's music to put together the first publication of his work. She started in 1998 looking for the holy presence of the Joan of Arc. And she was never able to find a score, but she did find a recording of its premiere at the Kitchen. It was difficult to find, and no one was really sure if there were other recordings and where they were. She realized that Eastman's music was only going to get more and more difficult to find. After years and years of being referred to one person, and then to another, and then back to the first, or sometimes herself, she finally found enough of Eastman's music to put together an anthology of his work. And in 2005, Unjust Malaise was released, and Eastman's music was finally made publicly available. Now, it's important to note that Leach is a composer, not a musicologist, and as far as I'm aware, has received no money for her efforts. So why was this person so compelled to spend 7 years of her life uncovering someone else's music? Eastman's music is usually grouped in with the minimalist composers of the 70s and 80s, like Steve Reich and Philip Glass. But as we'll see, Eastman was pretty much indifferent to stylistic boundaries. Unlike the cool procedural minimalism of Reich and Glass, Eastman's music is joyful, catchy, and energetic. It flies in the face of the stuffy, self-serious expectations that often come with performances of classical music. Eastman worked and studied at prestigious music institutions, like the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, and with the Creative Associates at SUNY Buffalo. He was also a fixture in the downtown New York scene and played with Meredith Monk and Arthur Russell. He was also a dancer, a choreographer, and he played in a jazz band with his brother. In case you didn't know, this kind of uptown-downtown mixing wasn't really the vibe for most 20th century composers. He was deeply committed to living an authentic life, no matter the cost.
What I'm trying to achieve is to be what I am to the fullest. Black to the fullest. A musician to the fullest. A homosexual to the fullest.
His uncompromising earnesty led him to compose some of the most unique and powerful music that I can think of. It spirals in on itself, building and building, gaining energy as it goes. It's mesmerizing and emotional. You feel it in your body. So instead of asking why it took Mary Jane Leach 7 years to recover Julius Eastman's music, maybe a better question is, why did she have to do it in the first place? So let's take a look at Julius Eastman, who he was and what he did, how his experiences shaped his music, and the importance of keeping his legacy alive and thriving. Julius Eastman was born in 1940. He grew up in Ithaca, New York, where he was raised mostly by his mom, who supported his musical interests. They had a grand piano in their house that he started playing when he was 6. And in grade school, he impressed his class with his singing skills in a production of Hansel and Gretel. He sang Stormy Weather for his grade 8 graduation, which, it's No Time of Your Life by Green Day, but... After high school, he was accepted at the prestigious Curtis School of Music in Philadelphia. And it seems like it was a difficult time. He was one of 2 black students in his class, and one of his few friends said that most of the other students steered clear of him because he was gay. He lived at the YMCA and had little to no money. His grades were spotty, but he worked extremely hard, practicing, studying, and composing in almost all of his spare time. He moved back to Ithaca and started to get some traction. He had successful recitals as a pianist and a singer, often playing some of his own compositions. In his late 20s, he started to make some contacts in Buffalo, which was, maybe a bit surprisingly, a great community for experimental music at that time. He was eventually offered a position with the prestigious Rockefeller-funded Creative Associates at SUNY Buffalo. This would have been a huge break for any composer at that time. The Creative Associates have featured the likes of David Tudor, Terry Riley, George Crumb, and Mariana Maché. Eastman was given a stipend, had no teaching obligations, and worked with some of the greatest experimental composers in the region. There he composed some of my favorite works of his, like Stay On It and Feminine. He also recorded the libretto of 8 Songs for a Mad King by Peter Maxwell Davies, which would be the thing he would be best known for in his lifetime. Although he's most celebrated for his compositions now, Eastman was best known for his vocal performances by his friends and contemporaries during his lifetime. His interest in jazz grew deeper and deeper while in Buffalo. He spent a lot of time hanging out with the jazz faculty at SUNY. In '73, his brother Jerry, who he taught piano to in grade school, moved to Buffalo and they started a jazz band together. Unfortunately, this relatively comfortable time in Eastman's life didn't last for very long. He became increasingly antagonistic and provocative, alienating many of his friends. He began to refuse to memorize parts and walked out on performances, in some cases quitting productions that had parts written specifically for him. Eastman was clearly a very complicated person, and I'm not going to try and analyze his behavior here. But it does seem like he felt limited in that environment. While in some senses it was cushy, he had a salary and minimal work obligations, which is basically every artist's dream, I can only imagine the kind of complex defenses one would have to have in order to survive as a black gay man, especially in the 1960s. This tension eventually boiled over when he gave a performance of John Cage's aleatoric songbooks piece in 1976. Eastman's boyfriend at the time helped out with the performance and was apparently completely naked by the end of the piece. Cage, who was closeted at the time, was deeply offended and insulted Eastman, saying,
"His ego is closed in on homosexuality, and we know this because he has no other ideas."
Eastman left Buffalo later that year for New York City and became quickly installed in the downtown scene. His reputation for his performance of Mad King and other avant-garde vocal works led him to perform regularly at the Kitchen, the Environs, and the Experimental Intermedia Foundation. He composed his self-proclaimed bad boy pieces here, including Gay Guerrilla, Evil N-Word, and Crazy N-Word. These titles have garnered a wide range of reactions from different people, but if you want to hear Eastman talk about it, there's a recording of him doing so at the beginning of the album Unjust Malaise. While in New York, Eastman straddled both the uptown and downtown worlds. He sang on Meredith Monk's Dolman music and became friends with Arthur Russell, even singing on the Dinosaur L record. He conducted at the Brooklyn Philharmonia, leading the community concert series that exclusively featured composers of color, including Tania Leon and Talib Hakim. Then in 1980, he gave a performance at Northwestern University that would ultimately become the most important of his career. The recordings from that night were eventually found by Mary Jane Leach and formed the majority of the Unjust Malaise release. In the 1980s, things started to unravel for Eastman. He was refused a teaching job at Cornell University, which many around him say was a huge blow to his sense of confidence and well-being. His mental health spiraled out of control and he was eventually evicted from his apartment, losing almost all of his scores and written work in the process. He lived at Tompkins Square Park and gave sporadic performances, but not much else is known about the last years of his life. So as you probably noticed from the intro section of this video, the background music is a cover that I did of Stay On It. But I want to make it clear that my version is not meant to be a replacement of the original. A big part of Eastman's work is about the performers listening to and reacting to each other in real time, which obviously I can't recreate alone on my laptop. But let's take a quick listen to get an idea of what the piece is like. So my version is obviously made with synthesizers and samples, but Stay On It is composed for any large ensemble so long as it includes percussion, piano, and voice. One of the things that really strikes me about Stay On It is that the performers can't seem to help but totally rock out while they're playing it, which is not really the vibe for most classical music concerts. But it's not just the joyfulness and energy that sets Eastman's music apart. I know this might sound kind of cheesy or exaggerated, but honestly, every time I hear one of his pieces, I get this verge of tears feeling in my chest, and I've been wondering why I always have that reaction. Part of it, I think, is that there's just something so powerful about the grace, intelligence, and courage that gets communicated through his music. But I also think there are some key structural elements that contribute to this effect. One of Eastman's main theoretical concepts is called organic music, which means that each section of a piece would contain all of the information from the previous sections. This sets it apart from other minimal music that usually is based on some kind of repetitive pattern that gets altered according to some procedure. The way I think about it is instead of going chunk by chunk, Eastman's music kind of spirals in on itself, showing us more and more of the world he sought to create as we go along. Another key point is Eastman's scores. Instead of working like instructions for a performer, his are more like a mnemonic device, just like something to jog his own personal memory. But I think the vagueness of his scores really push the performers to avoid over-calculating their interpretations. He forces them into the moment, making them listen to each other as they create the music in real time. I know that new approaches to notation and improvisation have been around for a long time, but I think it's important to note the role that Eastman's scores play in rendering an organic music. After Eastman left Buffalo, his pieces got more and more dissonant and intense. A different experience for sure, but no less powerful. Eastman's earlier works make the performers want to move their bodies, but his later ones take this kind of physicality to a whole new level. When I was researching this video, I came across an interview with some performers who had recently played Gay Guerrilla, and one of them spoke about reaching this point in the performance where she felt like she was about to totally run out of energy, but had to keep going because the piece wasn't over. And then she spoke about how rewarding it was to push herself to this other level. And the fact that I keep on saying this is going to become its own joke, but yeah, transcendental physicality isn't really the vibe for most classical music recitals. And I guess that might make you wonder, does it just not make sense to classify his music as classical? But I definitely think it does. He was a classically trained musician, and he was a part of a milieu that we generally consider, at least in some sense, classical. His pieces were performed by classically trained musicians. But I do think the fact that I can make the same joke 4 times about how he blatantly ignored these conventions does say something. It speaks to how uncompromising he was as an artist and his level of commitment to expressing something genuine. But it also speaks to the fact that our institutions are still pretty closed-minded and regressive, even though they definitely like us to believe that that's not the case. I'm not going to name names, but the school I went to didn't exactly get an A+ in terms of being a welcoming place to, well, anyone who wasn't a straight white dude. And I graduated 40 years after Eastman left Buffalo. I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about institutions. I think on some level, most of us are already pretty aware that they're problematic. But you can't ignore the context that Eastman was working in if you want to understand his music. I wish we didn't live in a racist, homophobic world, and I could just spend this whole video talking about his music. But yeah, it's not really the vibe. Julius Eastman died on May 28, 1990. And although the official cause of his death is cardiac arrest, scholars and people around him at the end of his life unanimously agree that he died of AIDS. I'm filming this video in December of 2020, and we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. But COVID is not the first major pandemic of our lifetimes. An estimated 33 million people have died of AIDS since that pandemic began. And although HIV does not just affect gay men, 10% of American gay men aged 25 to 44 died of AIDS before 1995. If you want to learn more, I put some links in the text description of this video. Thanks to the tireless work of Mary Jane Leach, we have access to the legacy of this brilliant man. And he was without a doubt one of the greatest contributors to 20th century music. He gracefully traversed both social and aesthetic boundaries in his life and his music. And he composed some of the most uncompromising and powerful work that I can think of. And he did it all in a deeply oppressive world that was absolutely not designed to support him or nurture his talents. So let's all do our part to keep the legacy of Julius Eastman alive. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this episode of Sounds Good. Julius Eastman's story is so powerful and I'm so excited to be able to bring it to you guys. I hope you liked it as much as I did. If you really like my work, consider supporting me at patreon.com/soundsgoodchannel, where you can get access to behind the scenes, early releases to the videos, and some other stuff. Also, I started a Twitter, so if you're a tweeter, come find me at the Twitter. Sounds Good 100. Who knew that Sounds Good would already be taken? Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and see you guys in 2 weeks.